The Second World War left behind many mysteries, the answers to which have not yet been received. One of the controversial issues remains the so-called miracle of Dunkirk, which historians have been arguing about for more than 80 years. After Germany's attack on Poland on September 1st, 1939, Great Britain and France, which had concluded a military alliance with the Poles a few days earlier, declared war on the Third Reich. However, the active actions stopped almost immediately, a period that began in history as a strange war began. Taking full advantage of the inactivity of the English and the French, Hitler, following Poland, occupied Denmark and Norway. The period of inactivity ended on May 10, 1940, when Germany began the implementation of the plan of a lightning war against Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Back in the early 1940s, the little-known at that time General Erich von Manstein made an unexpected proposal. Since the Allies expected the Germans to repeat Schlieffen's plan in the First World War and concentrate their main forces north of the borders of Belgium, Manstein proposed to take advantage of these circumstances and strike a major blow with large tank forces south of Ardennes, then force the Meuse River near Sedan, and then take a rapid march to the coast of La Manche, thus cutting off the northern group of Allied troops from the main forces. Despite the fact that the German command considered Manstein's plan quite risky, it was approved by Hitler, codenamed Gelb. In turn, this plan paved the way for the Roth Plan, a lightning-fast invasion of France through the Netherlands, bypassing the powerful fortifications of the Maginot Line. Meanwhile, the Allies were building their planning on the plan of Deelbred. The peculiarity of this plan was that, during its development, the military were following the example of English politicians, for whom the capture of Belgium and the Netherlands was unacceptable. In fact, the French military leadership had to go strictly against their own military doctrine. Instead of meeting the enemy on the battlefield, large masses of troops had to take a rapid maneuver to go to the unprepared defensive borders of Belgium and immediately engage in a confrontation with the enemy. Subsequently, the implementation of this plan led the Allied troops to disaster. On May 10, 1940, the German troops went on the offensive. Parts of the Wehrmacht attacked the Netherlands and Belgium, and the Allies considered this blow to be the main one. At first, everything, as it seemed, went according to plan. The Germans went directly to those borders where the Allies were going to break them. The British Expeditionary Corps and the powerful French army immediately moved towards Brussels. The main forces of the Allies were preparing for the decisive battle. However, the decisive battle was played out, but not there at all. In the Ardennes, where no one expected a major offensive, there were only second-rate French units. As a result, already in the first days, the Wehrmacht's tank rolled west, sweeping everything in its path. The counterattacks of the Allies did not lead to success. By May 14th, the Netherlands capitulated, Belgium held out longer, but its position quickly became hopeless. At that time, the British Expeditionary Forces, which numbered about 400,000 people, were in France. They were tasked with assisting the Allies in the offensive of the enemy on the Western Front. However, the German offensive in the Ardennes and their rapid advance caught the Allies by surprise, and all they could do was retreat. The commander of the British Expeditionary Corps, Lord Court, ordered to start retreating to the west, but it was too late. On May 20th, the German tank units broke through to Abbeville, and a large group of Allies troops was cut off and pressed to the sea. Surrounded, the Allied command began to look for a way out of a difficult situation. The Germans were hit by a counterattack near Arras. The 7th Division of Rommel and SS men from the Deadhead were hit. In some way, it resembled the future counterattacks of the Red Army in the summer of 1941. The Allies outnumbered the Germans in quantity and quality of tanks, but they did not know where and what forces the enemy had, and subsequently, as it should be, they could not establish the interaction of their units. In the battles in the area of Arras, the Rommel fighters put large-caliber anti-aircraft guns on the front, using them against the tanks. As a result, the battlefield was filled with dozens of burning fighting vehicles, and the Allies began to retreat to Dunkirk. The circle of encirclement was gradually narrowing. By May 23rd, the Germans occupied Boulogne-Calais. As a result, the last large port of Dunkirk remained under the control of the Allies, to which the parts of the Wehrmacht had to travel only about 20 kilometers. The British command clearly realized that it was no longer about holding the borders, but about saving the remaining forces. The Belgian army was quickly collapsing, and there was almost no hope of holding the coast of the British and French. However, when the German tank divisions were preparing for the last throw at Dunkirk on May 23rd, Hitler gave a fateful order about stopping the offensive. The first of the wonders of Dunkirk happened. The German units were ordered not to approach the city closer than 10 kilometers and not to use tanks against the encircled group. Hitler believed that tank divisions were stuck in battles with encircled units in an uncomfortable area, crossed by rivers and canals, and it was necessary to save them for a breakthrough into the depths of France. As a result, it was decided to compress the bag around Dunkirk primarily with the forces of infantry and aviation. In general, Hitler's order caused confusion among the German generals. At the same time, the commander of the 19th Tank Corps, Heinz Guderian, reluctantly responded to the orders from above if they, in his opinion, did not correspond to the operational situation. The next day, in spite of Hitler's order, the tanks of his corps and the Regiment of Great Germany captured the bridgehead on the eastern bank of the canal in the city of St. Georges, creating a direct threat to Dunkirk. Less than 20 kilometers straight to it remained. A little south, the SS Regiment Leibstandard captured the town of Wattan, located on the same hill, from which the port structures of Dunkirk could be seen with an unarmed gaze. Since the Allies could not ignore these actions, the next day, the battle groups of the 21st Infantry Division of the French knocked out the Germans on the western bank. The decisive factor was the total superiority of the Allies' artillery. The French actively used the batteries of heavy guns of Dunkirk's coastal defense, while all the artillery of Guderian was occupied by the Boulogne Gorge. Meanwhile, Hitler's order not only allowed the Germans to preserve their tank divisions, but also actually save the retreating English and French. If the Germans had thrown their tanks into battle, they could literally trample the Allies to the sandy beaches of Dunkirk. Meanwhile, the evacuation of the encircled group became inevitable. On May 25th, the command of the British Expeditionary Corps stopped all attempts to go into counteroffensive and concentrated efforts on the defense of Dunkirk. The main problem was that it would be extremely difficult to load a ship from an unarmed beach. At the same time, the port allowed the maximum number of people to quickly land on the ships. The situation of the Allies worsened every hour. So far, the encircled people have maintained discipline, but the front was gradually losing integrity. On May 28th, the Belgian army capitulated, and the Germans were restrained only by the preserved combat ability of the English and French detachments. At this time, in London, mass evacuation of the troops pressed to the sea was already being prepared. The operation was codenamed Dynamo. On May 20th, preparations began for the deployment of the forces pressed to La Manche, and on the 26th, an order was finally given for a general evacuation. Combat ships and civilian ships were used to transport people. The government called for the rescue of everyone who could only go to sea. Soldiers were taken on board not only in the port of Dunkirk, but also on adjacent beaches, where for small ships they created moorings from the water of the trucks. The Germans fiercely attacked the city and the port with the help of aviation artillery. But it was not possible to disrupt the evacuation in this way. Famous Spitfires and Hurricanes were flying from air bases in southern England to fight the Germans. The British fighters were quite successful in coping with the enemy. The power of German aviation turned out to be much less than expected. That is why the port of Dunkirk did not have such a terrible disaster. which will be played out in Sevastopol in 2 years. On May 29th, literally another miracle happened. A huge armada of civilian ships, from ordinary fishing boats to walking heaters, boats and yachts, began to cross the La Manche to take the soldiers out of the German fire. By May 30th, 100,000 people had been evacuated. On the same day, Churchill gave special orders for the British ships to take the French from Dunkirk along with the English. June 1st was one of the most difficult days of evacuation. Luftwaffe forces destroyed 31 British fighters and drowned 31 ships, including 4 Allied destroyers at once. However, on the same day, 64,000 soldiers were transported across the Albion Strait. On the night of June 4th, the German infantry came to the offensive and approached Dunkirk more and more closely. However, the bulk of the encirclement had already reached the English shores. The defense lines around Dunkirk were heavily defended by the French and the English until the last opportunity. The Germans, on Hitler's initiative, were deprived of the opportunity to use their main weapon, the tank units. Guderian and Rommel watched with annoyance and rabidness as the booty left the tray. But they could not do anything. The time had already been lost. On June 4th, the evacuation was completed. Almost 340,000 people were rescued within 9 days, of which 224,000 were British and 114,000 were soldiers of Allied countries, mainly French. More than 2,000 sailors were killed when crossing the sea. About 50,000 French soldiers, who were covering the approaches to Dunkirk, were taken prisoner. In Dunkirk, the Allies were forced to drop a large number of vehicles, fuel, and ships, which sank during German attacks. Almost 2,500 artillery guns, 65,000 cars, 70,000 tons of ammunition, 150,000 tons of fuel, 8,000 machine guns, including all heavy weapons and transport of 9 English divisions. But all this did not go into any comparison with the rescue of people. The British managed to save the capable personnel army, which made it possible to continue the war. Thus, the history of defeat turned into a history of heroic rescue, from which the myth of Dunkirk, which is overgrown with dramatic details, immediately began to form. Some circumstances of this most important episode of the Second World War are still in question. The main one is why tank divisions were stopped at the most crucial moment. Some historians tend to say that Hitler was counting on the Union of Britain and did not want that the meat grinder at La Manche would break all possible threads between the two countries. In his speeches in the summer of 1940, Hitler openly said that there were no reasons to continue the war between Germany and Great Britain and called to sit down at the negotiating table. The vital space, the conquest of which was the most important part of Hitler's ideas, was not in the West, but in the East. The war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, and to prepare for it, Hitler wanted to get rid of the threat of war on 2 fronts. With the defeat of France, it seriously decreased, but did not disappear completely. Giving the opportunity to the British to leave Dunkirk, Hitler tried to create conditions for an honorable world, in which he wanted to end the war in the West. Also, many researchers of those events say that the Minister of Aviation, Hermann Göring, was able to convince Hitler that his planes would cope with the retreating Allies and tank divisions should be preserved for the further conquest of France. In addition, there is an opinion that Hitler was afraid of the advance of the French troops from other positions and decided not to waste his forces on finishing the weakened enemy. Anyway, the miracle of Dunkirk took place, and the third component of this miracle was the bad weather that settled for several days, which significantly complicated the work of German aviation and gave a break to the people and ships thrown to the rescue of the Allied army. Winston Churchill hoped that only under a successful coincidence, about 45,000 soldiers would be able to return to Britain. Therefore, speaking on June 4th in the House of Commons, he called what happened in Dunkirk a miraculous salvation. At the same time, he offered to look at things soberly. The English Prime Minister said that we must be very careful and not attribute the quality of victory to this salvation. Evacuations do not win wars. However, German generals, after the war, could not quite agree with this statement of Churchill. General Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, whose plan allowed to occupy France in his memories in just a few months, wrote, "We were deluded by the spectacle of military equipment left by the enemy in a huge number on the coast of Dunkirk, and we did not yet know that the English had completely saved their army."